Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101. I am your host, Brian Bowen. All right, today we are going to be discussing the origin of life with Dr. Georgia Purdom as part of the Genesis series. And this is a very fundamental issue. This is going to be extremely fundamental to the whole subject matter of creation versus evolution. I know a lot of evolutionists don't think it's fundamental. It is fundamental. I have Dr. Georgia Purdom from Answers in Genesis that's going to be on this channel, and this is her first time on this channel, and we are going to be discussing the origin of life. She, because of time restraints, she was only able to give me about 30-minute interview, so it's a short interview, and so they'll make it a little longer, but it's still going to be a short video overall, but it's okay. I also got some news and some updates to make on my upcoming response video. And without further ado, let's dive in. All right, we're here today with Dr. Georgia Purdom. Is that how you pronounce your name correctly?
Georgia.
Yeah,
hmm
Georgia Purdom. Okay. From Answers in Genesis, and we're going to, or the origin of life. Before we dive into this, I know we only have a very short time, so just real briefly, can you give like some background information?
Sure. So I have been in Answers in Genesis for 17 years now. I have a PhD in molecular genetics from Ohio State University. I taught college for a short time before coming and joining the staff here. And I've been working here I'm currently the vice president of educational content, but I work as a speaker, a writer, and do a lot of different things with programming and curriculum as well for Answers in Genesis.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been actually wanting to do this subject with you for a long time, even before I had my Genesis series. Um, uh, I really appreciate the content that I've seen you do and videos, and I know you appear on Answers News as well.
Yes.
So I think that's awesome, and I think I seen your video on the flood once.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, on YouTube.
Awesome. All right, so let's dive into this. First of all, the subject of the origin of life. This is something that a lot of evolutionists, in one sense, they do actually admit this is an issue. This is a problem. I mean, they try to demote it into a side issue, like, yeah, that's we don't know exactly how life got started, but it's not relevant to the subject of evolution. What would you say to someone who thinks this topic is irrelevant?
Well, I think you said it absolutely correct that they will not deal with it. They'll say it's a separate issue, that we're just talking about things. We're just talking about life once it's already gotten started, and that's what we want to focus on. But to me, I'm like, you can't focus on those issues until you deal with the central one, which is how you get something living from something that is non-living. That has to happen first, or there's no point of even talking about anything beyond that. And it doesn't, it's useless basically, because if you can't even explain that, then we don't have anything else to discuss. And it was really interesting. So recently I was inputting some things into Chat GPT to see what kinds of answers it would give me for certain things with the artificial intelligence. And one of the things I asked it was, does spontaneous generation, or does the law of biogenesis, which is that life comes from life, does that contradict evolutionary theory? And it's like, no. And I'm like, And it's like, because again, it's been programmed by people that are evolutionists, obviously, that have taught it to say that, and to respond in that way. And it's basically like, well, they're two separate things. We're not talking about the origin of life. We're talking about the issue of evolution. And I thought, wow, it's just amazing to see. And even the whole idea of biogenesis, one of the things I've noticed in textbooks, they don't call it a law anymore, right? It's just called biogenesis or the theory of biogenesis. And I'm like, wait a minute. Why are you doing that? And I have a sneaking suspicion the reason they're doing it is because they know it contradicts evolutionary ideas. They know that. And so they're not even going to call it a law because they know at some point they have to have life come from non-life. And so they don't want to even admit that that could be contradictory and that is contradictory and problematic.
Some background information there for everybody else. Around the 1800s, 1800s, they believe in something called spontaneous generation. A scientist by the name of Dr. What was it? I know his last name is Pasteur.
Louis Pasteur.
Louis Pasteur discovered that was not the case. Some people thought like you leave meat long enough and it turns into maggots, and you leave milk long enough and turns into bacteria. But that wasn't true. Milk already has bacteria in it. It just grew, and the meat attracts bugs or flies, and they leave the larva in the meat. So that's basically how that came about. So essentially, I forgot the Latin term he came up with, but it translates as life from life.
Right. That's the idea. I don't know Latin either.
But Louis Pasteur was actually a Christian. So that's interesting. But but you're right. They don't want to deal with this. This is something whenever I was discussing the issue of evolution with Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, I told him, was like, you have to justify that first step in evolution. You can't just sit there and say, hey, look, let's start at step 50. If you're going to say it's a step-by-step process, then you're going to have to justify that first step. I mean, because you have to be able to explain how you got this ball rolling in the first place. What started it. You can't claim natural selection did it, because natural selection wouldn't have taken effect until afterwards. Right. And on top of that, natural selection doesn't really add anything new, like new information or anything like that. It actually subtracts from that. So you reduce the information. So you don't have that to fall back on, or even mutations. So how do you count life from non-living material? Which brings me to my next question. A lot of neo-Darwinists believe in something called abiogenesis. Now, my understanding is that Charles Darwin actually didn't. Well, he didn't put it in his books. He's got two books. I got them over here somewhere. Right here. He got these two books out, but he doesn't really talk about abiogenesis in there. From what I understand, he talks about it in a letter where he suggested the possibility of abiogenesis. But a lot of neo-Darwinists picked that up from that point and believed that somehow life could start from non-living material. Now, how much do they, since they don't really want to talk about the origin of life, is abiogenesis kind of put on the back burner as well?
Yeah, it's the same. It's all related, right? Because it's all, how do you get because abiogenesis, which is the opposite of biogenesis, is the idea that you could get life from non-life, basically. And one of the things, like, so I've studied bacteria a lot, and that's one of the things they would say, well, there was some simple cell, right, that originated from non-living things. And I mean, they come up with ideas about how this could happen, but again, it's all just storytelling, because they have no idea. I mean, we've never seen anything like this. Even when you have all the right materials together, life doesn't just come about from non-life. And so it's very interesting, because they'll try to go talk about bacteria and how simplistic, bacteria are, and that, well, maybe they were, representatives of the first types of cells that were there. But yet when you study bacteria, they're really, really, really complex. And they're one cell. I mean, our body has trillions of cells and can carry out things. They're one cell that has to carry out a lot of different functions and a lot of different things. And so trying to even go back to that and explain, well, they wouldn't need as much DNA, they wouldn't need, as many functions and all that. Well, that's true. They're much simpler than a human being, but they're very complex in their own right. And you still have to explain, how do they get the genetic material, DNA, because that's going to be the most stable. RNA isn't very stable. Proteins are, again, you have to have which is first, the chicken or the egg. So they'll say, well, it takes proteins to make DNA and RNA, but then you need the DNA and RNA to make the protein. So you run into that chicken and egg issue. And so the problem is that even the simplest DNA, I mean, strand, to put that together, to even get the bases that make that up, like people don't study this, don't even realize it is an extremely complex process just to make the bases that go into the DNA, notwithstanding the fact that you have to then put them in a certain order so that they will give you information that makes sense and can make proteins and do things. I mean, there's just no way. It totally goes against common sense that this could happen by random chance over eons of time.
Right. And DNA and RNA, they need each other too.
Yes, they do.
And so you wind up with that chicken and egg problem as a result. I would just happen to be reading an article of yours not earlier today concerning where people thought, oh, we can synthesize a molecule that could carry information too. And you said, yeah, you could do something like that, but then where did that information come from in the first place? See, that you can always create something that could carry that information, because that's all really DNA is doing, is carrying that information. It's just like a CD. The CD is the physical component, but the information is inside the CD. It's non-material, and it's there. The CD is just the carrying product. It's what's carrying it. So the question has to be, where did that information come from? And in order to, in the origin of life issue, you're going to have something that's going to gain that information and start the information too, because I mean, and they don't have that process. I do want to ask you about the Miller-Urey experiment. I never hear about that anymore. I don't know if evolutionists themselves acknowledge it's a failed experiment or what the case, but I never hear anyone speak about the Miller-Urey experiment anymore. When I was just early on in my time as a Christian apologist, I used to hear that all the time, brought up in books and I know Icons of Evolution, Jonathan Wells has that in there, and Lee Strobel talked about in The Case for a Creator. But now it's like nobody speaks about the Miller-Urey experiment. So do they kind of know that that's like, out to lunch or whatnot?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. And I hadn't really thought about that, but you're right that you don't really, it's just like with biogenesis, they kind of remove certain things, like it's not a law anymore, we'll just call it this. And I do wonder if some of it probably comes from the fact that it's getting further and further, like we're getting further and further away from it, this is 2023. And so that took place quite a while ago now, more than it had, even when I started here at Answers in Genesis. And so so part of it's probably that. I think part of it too is that I think they realize that experiment doesn't help them at all, right? It didn't give them anything basically but black goo. And it gave them maybe a few amino acids or a few, things, but again, they're not composed, they're not put together in any meaningful way. So you need something else. And I think a lot of the study has shifted more to outer space, because they do realize that you can't get this information in the amount of time that you have here on Earth. Well, you can't get it, period. But even if you had, let's say, that all you needed was time, right? Which isn't true. I always say time is not your problem. The problem is you don't have a mechanism. You don't have a way to add information to go from one kind of organism to another. So the time isn't really the issue. But even if you had somehow a mechanism, the amount of time you would need would just be astronomical. It's way more than we have here on Earth, because they keep finding these quote unquote complex organisms that are really old in the rock record. And they're like, well, I'm like, oh, you've got a problem, right? Because you're shrinking the amount of time for evolution to occur. And so that's an issue. And so they'll push it into outer space and say, well, it came from a meteor, or it came from some other place, because the rest of the universe is a lot older, right? It's 15 billion years old compared to the only 4 billion years of the Earth. And so they'll say, well, it evolved out here and then it came to Earth. The idea of panspermia, or there were aliens that evolved, somewhere. Of course, they still have to have evolved. So I don't know how you get that, but they had to evolve. And then they sent, they seeded Earth with things, but it's just pushing it somewhere else, basically, because they don't have a lot of good explanations. Like you say, with the Miller-Urey experiment, they just don't have a lot of good explanations for it with things that have been done here on Earth.
You actually hit on another question of mine. I'm going to ask that in a second, but a little bit more on the Miller-Urey experiment. They also found a mixture of left-handed and right-handed amino acids, correct? And only left-handed amino acids are actually used in proteins for life. They're that make up the cells for life.
And you are correct that life only uses the whichever you said, I think the left-handed amino acid. It cannot use the right-handed ones. And so it would, in their experiments, you got pretty much equal amounts of that. So that's, again, problematic, how to just select out the ones that would work.
And the other point that I was going to make about that is that any experiment that you conduct concerning the origin of life is only going to prove that you can't produce life naturally through natural processes, because you have to add intelligence to that. So,
absolutely.
That's a point that I think that a lot of evolutionists are getting the hint that every single time someone's going to bring up an experiment, when the question is arising from natural processes, they're going to say, hey, look, you're inserting intelligence into that. You're inserting a mind into that. In the Miller-Urey experiment, there was all sorts of controlled elements, having to remove the goo from the atmosphere because it was harmful, and things like that. They had assumed that the oxygen, that there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, because oxygen would destroy biological molecules and stuff, right?
Well, and the other thing too is that they have found that some of the conditions they had for that experiment aren't reflected in the rock record. And so they would say, well, actually there was oxygen. And so that's a problem, because that experiment then isn't as valid, because we now know more. That could be another reason it's not being used, because as they continue to find things, they're finding things like oxygen, which are going to be actually really problematic for the start of life, and how they think it happened. And so that may be another reason that they're not using it, just because they don't believe that what they're finding is for how things used to be, is similar to what they used for that experiment.
You brought up them trying to pass life onto another planet and finding it in trying to find it in meteorites and things like that. If I'm not mistaken, I believe Richard Dawkins is very famous for that thesis. In logic, we usually call that fallacy the fallacy of or fallacy of infinite regress, where you just kind of put it on there. And the question that we're asking is the ultimate question of how life started. Putting it off on some other planet doesn't do any good.
Well, and I always say too, one of the things that I don't understand from an evolutionary standpoint is, why would you think that life on another planet is even similar to life here? Why is it we talk about looking for life on other planets too, and a lot of that comes from these ideas that life here had to come from somewhere else. Well, why? And so they develop these detection systems. They're looking for carbon, they're looking for oxygen, and I'm thinking, why do you think it's the same? Because if evolution is true, there's nothing saying that life on other planets had to evolve the same way that it did here. Maybe it's silicon based, maybe it's based on something else, sulfur based, I don't know. But it's just, I think it's really interesting that they keep looking for life just like it is here on planet Earth. And I'm like, you don't have a basis for thinking that way. From a biblical worldview, we certainly would, because we believe God created everything. And so we believe that if there's something out there, it's created by God and would be similar to what we have here, And so I don't understand. I don't understand that from an evolutionary perspective, why it has to look exactly the same. That doesn't fit with an evolutionary worldview.
All right. The question of the hour: what would it take um, I mean, basically, what would they need to be able to produce life? I mean, exactly, what would they need? It's obviously not just the right ingredients.
Right.
That's what they thought. At one time, they thought that life was like a soup mix. You just add water and you got life. But we
Right.
now know that's not true. Life is far more complex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's not anything they could do. And they would admit that too, in the sense that they would say, well, it's going to take billions of years and you can't simulate that in the lab. There's no way. So that's how they always get out of it, is to say, well, it just takes too much time. We can't, obviously observe that much time. So there's no way to be able to do an experiment like that to really prove that. You just have to have faith in that deep time that it will do wonderful, miraculous things if you just give it enough of that. But again, I don't know how you even begin to prove or even show that life could come from non-life. I mean, how do you? I don't even know what you would do, because you have to have a way to form. Even if you say, let's say DNA is the first thing, you've got to have a way to form those bases. You've got to have a way to put those bases together in a meaningful way. And it's not just for the production of proteins. I think we often kind of get caught up in that, like the genes, which give rise to the proteins, the information for that. You've got to regulate those proteins. You've got to know when, where, why, how much, under what condition. So it's not just the protein itself that you got to have the instructions for. You got to have all the regulatory mechanisms in place. And just common sense tells us, right? No one thinks that their smartphone came about because someone put all the parts together in a bag, shook it, and out popped a smartphone. I mean, no one thinks that. It's just, that's why it's so unbelievable, right? We know that that's just not an experience. That's not common sense, to believe that. And yet, so I think what it really shows is that people's hearts are really hardened against God. And so they will do what just seems nonsensical and, doesn't fit with anything we know, in order to avoid saying that God is the creator.
Right. I was wondering, you mentioned something about they started with DNA. There is a hypothesis called the RNA hypothesis. What do you think of that?
Well, again, the problem is, and the reason they say that is because RNA can do some of these things that DNA can't. So it can, I mean, obviously it gives the instructions for the proteins directly. So it's messenger RNA, at least. It can do some of its own cleaving, so cutting itself, so to speak, which is good. But again, it's usually a very unstable molecule. So it's only single stranded, not double stranded like DNA. And you still have to explain, how do you get the bases for it? Because it's also made up of bases, just like DNA is. And how do you put them together in a meaningful way that gives you what you need? And so you're still going, and at some point you're going to have to form DNA, because you're going to have to go from RNA to DNA. You got to have proteins to do that. So how do you do that? I mean, and form that molecule, and just the number of things that you have to have, just, it's infinite. I don't know how, I mean, God, I mean, it's not infinite, but it's big. It's really, really big. And so the only one that's able to do that is God, because he is infinite and he can think of all these things and do this, where in our finite minds, we have no way of even being on the verge of that, so to speak.
Right. Do you see this kind of like a chicken and egg problem kind of thing with the DNA and RNA again? Because it's
Yeah.
like, okay, how do you get DNA from a single, RNA, and
Mhm.
how would that come about? Is the
Yeah.
RNA hypothesis very popular? Is it gone out of popularity or what?
I haven't really heard much about it recently. They'll come up with, maybe proteins were the first thing. I mean, they'll come up with they've kind of like tried to talk about all of them as being possibly the first thing, so to speak, because DNA is very hard to form under those conditions. And they do get amino acids, but to my knowledge, they never get nucleotides. So it's kind of easier to start with the amino acids, they would probably say. But again, you would have to, even if somehow we go all the way in reverse, you're going to have to have a meaningful way to put those amino acids together to make something that then you would go backwards basically and make into RNA and then make into DNA. And you don't have a way to do that. Like you say, the main problem with all these experiments is they're requiring intelligent input to do in the first place. And so that doesn't prove your point.
Right. All right. I think we're getting close to the end of our time. Is there anything that you wanted to add, something in closing, just to kind of, put that out there for the audience?
Yeah, I just encourage people, with all of these things, anytime somebody comes up with an idea, whether it's an evolution or origin of life, you got to think about, why are they doing that? Why do they not want to believe the Bible? Because, we can argue about these types of things all day, but the real crux of the matter is the Bible true in what it says, or is it not? And we really want to do that because we want to share the gospel with people, right? We don't want it to just be, well, you're an evolutionist and, that's not right and all, but we want to get to, why do they believe that way? Why don't they believe what God's word says? And really get to the heart of the matter, I guess I would say, with people. So I would just encourage people to think about those things and think about, these are sinners in need of a savior. And we want to talk, right? The reason that we're trying to defend our faith and defend it well is to help them know Jesus Christ. And just to always keep that in mind. It can be easy to get upset, and it can be easy to get very argumentative with people, but we need to remember the reason that we're defending God's word is to show the gospel to people. And so just to I need to be reminded of that, and I think everyone else probably does as well.
We should always keep the gospel and the word of God in mind. And obviously, this is obviously being used as an excuse to not believe the Bible, because the Bible tells them something they don't want to hear, and then they have this to try to fall back on. And but
Right.
they do raise it up a lot to people, and so it's good to talk about this. Like I said, I'm doing this Genesis series, and I wanted to talk about this issue because I think it's very fundamental to the subject matter. Because you need, like you said, you have to justify that first step.
Right.
You
Yeah.
have to be able to get life started. You're gonna have to get information. You're gonna have to get everything in the right order. You're gonna have to get DNA. You're gonna have to do all these things, and there's just not enough time to do it, even if you had a mechanism. And they don't even
Right.
have a mechanism.
Nope.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Purdom. I really
Sure.
do appreciate it very much. I'm
Right.
hoping that, if it's okay, originally I was going to do like origin of information and origin of life, but they said that you only have about 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So
Sorry. I
that,
have to go to the
that's
Ark and speak today. So yeah, it's kind of a
that's fine.
busy time. Yeah.
So maybe we can do another 30-minute interview at some point and
Okay.
get more in depth into the subject matter of information, and maybe we can get in subject like mutations and things like that.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'd love to talk about that. I probably know more about the mutation, the natural selection than I would about the information idea. Getting into the nitty gritty of that, that's sort of not my thing. Jason Lyle, have you interviewed him yet?
oh, many times. He was the very first person
Oh,
to
okay.
be on there. My distant
Okay.
starlight video that I did with him, that was the last video I did with him. That's like over 3,000 views right now.
Oh,
So yeah,
wow. He would probably
he's
be
a
a
very
good
popular
one on
speaker.
he would be a good one on the origin of information too. He would be probably really good on that
Yeah.
one. Yeah.
If I could, I would have Dr. Jason Lyle in here on just about every issue. He's like my favorite Christian apologist, but he's just so real busy. It's hard to get him in nowadays,
Yeah.
especially for YouTube interviews, because he's from what I understand from his assistant, he's writing like a couple books and things like that. So
Mm,
he's just kind of prioritizing those things. But
yeah.
but it's great to have different people in there, and I really do appreciate your time very
Sure.
much. And thank you again, and I hope and good luck with your ARC presentation.
Yeah.
I do
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. All right,
All
no
right.
problem.
Thanks, Brian.
All right,
Bye.
bye. Thank you again for watching Apologetics 101. This has been great. I had a great discussion with Dr. Georgia Purdom. The origin of life is a fundamental issue involving the creation versus evolution discussion. I know evolutionists don't think it is. It is. It's not a side issue. It is. It is a major issue. You got to get this ball started. You got to be able. You can't claim that evolution happened and you skip the first step. You wouldn't be able to do that. You have to be able to explain where the life came from. So I think origin of life is a very fundamental issue to the discussion. I really enjoyed my time discussing this with Dr. Georgia Purdom. I wanted to have this kind of discussion with Dr. Georgia Purdom for a long time now, even before the Genesis series. Um, uh, I learned a lot here, and it's been great. I hope to have her back again eventually in the Genesis series. So maybe to talk about mutations, I'm thinking about maybe doing one with her on mutations and natural selection, since she said that is an area that she actually does really well in, and something that's more closer to her area of knowledge. And it would be great to have that. Um, some changes and updates about my uh, coming response video. Unfortunately, Dr. Tompkins won't be joining me on here. After Carter's response video had aired, and I um, uh, and linked it in the email that I sent to him, and he watched a little bit of it. He said that he doesn't want to add to the confusion, and by coming up publicly on an interview, following on the heels of Dr. Carter's response, he needs time to process through what Dr. Carter had presented in his video. He needed time to review, possibly because Carter mentioned something about sending a paper on his method to the Journal of Creation. Dr. Tompkins thinks that he might be asked to be one of the reviewers. So he needs time to actually look at the arguments and process what he said to discuss it or to be able to discuss it further on that. So Dr. Tompkins sadly won't be joining me on this channel for that reason. I really would love to him to show up on this, um, but unfortunately, this whole controversy that I'm engaged in is very complex. It's extremely complex, much more complex than I actually originally anticipated. What started out as a typical response video turned out to be something far more, and I'm not involved into a controversy that is extremely just exploded on YouTube. So I'm going to make some changes and some directional changes to where I was planning on going with my response video, and it's going to be much more of a major issue. I'm going to still have all the same interviews I've had already previously. I'm going to be dealing with the whole controversy, the whole discussion concerning what I've been labeling as the Tompkins controversy, and I'm thinking about turning this into a series, because this is really becoming far more complex than I know. It would just be an additional series, separated from the Genesis series. I'll still have my Genesis series. I'll still be doing videos on the Genesis series, but I'm thinking about doing this as a very small series. But it's going to involve the whole controversy in general. There's so much that I can't be able to put into just one video. And so I'm thinking about doing it that way because I think there's a lot of issues here. And of course, everybody has their ideas, their opinions, and it's heavily heated. I don't know where all this heat's coming from. I mean, you think that chimp and human similarity and dissimilarity wouldn't be a big deal. It's just numbers on a piece of paper. Tomorrow, they'll come up with a different number. They'll have new data, and whatever they said previously would be out the window. But unfortunately, this has caused a lot of stir and a lot of heat, and people calling people stupid, calling people liars, all kinds of stuff, and it's gotten really bad really fast. And so I wanted to try to get a handle on this controversy, and so I'm going to be presenting what I think is I'm going to be calling it the Tompkins controversy, and it's going to be a major series, and we'll see how that works out. I will still be responding, of course, to Erica, including to Erica's specific arguments that she made, as well as arguments that she made in her response to my video interview with Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins. So we'll be getting all into that. And so this is going to be great. If you do not subscribe to my channel, please subscribe, like the videos. Don't forget to hit that notification bell. Drop me a comment below. I would love to hear from you. If you wonder why my throat sounds like this, it's because I'm getting overstrapped. I'm still taking antibiotics. I still got a little bit of it. But pray for me. If you're a Christian, pray for me. But anyway, it has been great. Again, I enjoyed having this discussion with Dr. Georgia Purdom. I hope to have her back, hopefully sometime soon. All right, that's all for now. This is Brian Bowen from Apologetics 101, signing off.